My son was lying in a hospital bed with 28 broken bones because a group of self-proclaimed HOA police had brutally assaulted him. They thought they could hide behind the shield of the Homeowners Association, but they had no idea I'd been a federal prosecutor for 15 years. Now those thugs were facing life sentences, and I'm going to tell you how I exposed an entire corruption ring in our neighborhood. Where are you watching this video from? Comment below, because this story will show you exactly how to deal with power-abusing bullies right in your own community. I still remember the day we moved into Oak Ridge Estates. The realtor couldn't stop gushing about the premier private security system and the tight-knit community values. Sarah, my wife, fell in love with the sprawling park at the center of the development, while our son Tyler was sold on the Olympic-sized community pool. After 15 years as a federal prosecutor dealing with drug cartels and organized crime, I was ready for some peace and quiet. A high-profile case involving the Rivera cartel had resulted in threats against my family, and the stress had begun affecting my health. So at 52, I took early retirement, and we invested a significant portion of our savings into what we thought would be our forever home. The neighborhood seemed perfect on paper. Well-maintained streets, pristine lawns, and neighbors who smiled and waved as we moved in our furniture. I should have known better. In my career, I'd seen enough polished facades hiding rot underneath to be wary. But I wanted so badly to believe we had found sanctuary that I ignored the warning signs. The first hint of trouble came about 3 months after we'd settled. The HOA fees, which had been quoted at $300 per month during our purchase, suddenly increased to $450 with a vague explanation about enhanced security measures. I attended the next homeowners meeting to inquire about the increase, and that's when I first met Karen Whitaker, the HOA president. She was in her early 60s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, shaking my hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm, "we're simply ensuring that Oak Ridge maintains its exceptional standards. The security team requires proper compensation for their dedication to our safety." Something about her demeanor set off alarm bells in my mind, but I chalked it up to professional paranoia. The next red flag appeared when I noticed the security personnel around the neighborhood. They drove vehicles that closely resembled police cruisers, complete with light bars, though they were amber instead of red and blue. They wore uniforms that, at first glance, could be mistaken for police uniforms, and they carried themselves with an authority that seemed excessive for mall cops, which is essentially what they were. "Don't you think they're a bit intimidating for a neighborhood watch?" I asked Michael Chon, our next-door neighbor, a law professor at the local university. Michael glanced nervously over his shoulder before responding. "Between you and me, they've gotten more aggressive since Karen took over the HOA 3 years ago. Last month, the Jenkins family got fined $2,000 because their teenager had friends over past the noise curfew. When Mr. Jenkins protested, security showed up at his workplace the next day, said they were following up on complaints. He paid the fine and hasn't said a word since. I filed that information away but didn't act on it. A part of me, the part that had spent years fighting battles, just wanted peace. Besides, Tyler was thriving. At 17, he was breaking records on the track team and had colleges already expressing interest in offering him athletic scholarships. Sarah had found a teaching position at the local elementary school and was happier than I'd seen her in years. I decided that I could live with an overzealous HOA if it meant my family was content. That willful blindness came to an abrupt end on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was preparing for a 3-day consulting trip to Washington, D.C. when Tyler burst into my home office, his face flushed with anger. "Dad, this is complete bull. The Wilsons reported me for parking incorrectly in front of our own house." He thrust me a piece of paper, an official notice from the HOA citing a $500 fine for parking violations and displaying inappropriate attitude unbecoming of an Oakage resident. I scanned the document, noting that it was signed by Marcus Reed, Chief of Oakage Security. "This doesn't make sense," I said, frowning. "You always park in the driveway." Tyler ran a hand through his dark hair, a habit he'd had since childhood when frustrated. "I had to park on the street for like 20 minutes because Mom needed to get her car out. Mr. Wilson came over and started lecturing me about blocking his view of the street, which I wasn't. When I tried to explain, he just walked away and called security. By the time they showed up, I had already moved the car, but they wrote me up anyway." I was about to assure him that I'd handle it when my phone pinged with an email. The sender was anonymous, but the message made my cull boot prints, the distinctive pattern left when someone stomps on a limb with force. She leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "In my professional opinion, your son was held down and systematically beaten over a period of time. This wasn't a fight, it was torture." I felt physically ill, but forced myself to think clearly. "Would you be willing to document this officially, to testify if needed?" Dr. Martinez nodded without hesitation. "I've already included my analysis in his medical records, and yes, I'll testify. What happened to your son was criminal, Mr. Sullivan, pure and simple." As I left her office, I spotted a familiar face at the nurse's station, Lisa Ramirez, a detective with the city police department. I'd worked with her on a few federal cases years ago. She looked up as I approached, her expression carefully neutral. "Robert Sullivan, I heard you retired." I nodded, cutting to the chase. "My son is the assault victim in the ICU. I want to know what's being done." Detective Ramirez sighed, gesturing for me to follow her to a quieter corner. "I've been assigned the case, but I'll be straight with you. It's complicated. The security team has filed their own report, claiming self-defense. They say your son became violent when informed about potential consequences for his disruptive behavior. Without video evidence or witnesses willing to contradict them, it's a tough case." I fought to keep my voice steady. "My son has 28 broken bones. Dr. Martinez has documented that the injuries are consistent with a prolonged, deliberate assault. That's not self-defense." Ramirez held up a hand. "I know and I believe you, but for an arrest I need more than a medical opinion. I need concrete proof of criminal intent. Witnesses, preferably video evidence. Give me something to work with, Robert." As she walked away, I realized I was on my own, at least for now, and that's when I began to formulate a plan. The next morning, I called Frank Delgado, a former colleague who now ran a private investigation firm. Frank arrived at the hospital within the hour, his bulk filling the small consultation room where we met. His expression softened when he saw the photos of Tyler. "Jesus, Robert, this is medieval." I nodded grimly. "I need everything you can dig up on the Oak HOA board members, especially Karen Whitaker and the security chief, Marcus Reed. And I need surveillance on my house and family. These people have already shown what they're capable of." Frank didn't hesitate. "Consider it done. I'll have a team in place by this evening." As he turned to leave, he paused. "Robert, be careful. If these people are willing to do this to a kid, they won't hesitate to come after you too." I knew he was right, but retreating wasn't an option. Not anymore. While Tyler began the long road to recovery, I started building my case. Frank's initial findings were illuminating. Marcus Reed had been dismissed from the Riverside Police Department 5 years earlier, following multiple excessive force complaints. 2 of his officers had similar backgrounds, men who had been deemed too violent or corrupt for actual law enforcement, but had found a home in private security, where oversight was minimal. Karen Whitaker, it turned out, had previously worked as a real estate agent before her retirement and had connections to several development companies in the area. Her deputy, Greg Thompson, was a lawyer specializing in real estate law who had been censured twice by the Bar Association for ethics violations. The picture was beginning to form, but I needed more. I spent the next few days visiting neighbors, carefully probing for information. Most were reluctant to talk, their fear palpable. But a few, once assured of confidentiality, shared stories that revealed a pattern. The Jenkins family, as Michael had mentioned, had been fined repeatedly for minor infractions until they finally sold their home at a significant loss. The Rodriguezes had been threatened with legal action when they installed solar panels without proper approval, despite having followed all city regulations. And Elaine Washington, a 70-year-old widow whose husband had died the previous year of a heart attack, confided that he had been under immense stress due to HOA harassment over disputed fees. Hold was an accountant, she told me, her voice barely above a whisper as we sat in her immaculate living room. He kept saying something wasn't right with the HOA financials, but no one would listen. The day before he died, we received a foreclosure notice for unpaid fees. We had receipts for all the payments. 10 days after the assault, Tyler was released from the hospital. He was wheelchair-bound, his arms and legs encased in casts. His spirit dimmed, but not broken. "I just wanted to tell them they couldn't threaten me," he said as I helped him settle into his bedroom, now transformed with a hospital bed and medical equipment, leading me to a small home office that remained untouched since her husband's death. He didn't trust computers much, so it's all in these ledgers and files. She pulled out several heavy folders from a filing cabinet. After he passed, I couldn't bear to go through them, but I couldn't throw them away either. Maybe they'll help you. I spent hours poring over Harold's meticulous notes. He had tracked HOA fee increases, expenditures, and property sales within the neighborhood for years, and slowly a pattern emerged. Over the past 3 years, since Karen took control of the HOA, an unusually high number of homes had been sold, often after the owners had faced escalating fines and harassment. And most interestingly, while the properties had been purchased by what appeared to be different buyers, Harold had traced the ownership back to a web of shell companies, all ultimately connected to a single entity, Whitaker and Associates, Karen's own real estate company, which she had supposedly shuttered years ago, was secretly buying up the neighborhood. But why? The answer came when I cross-referenced Harold's notes with city planning documents available online. There was a proposal, still in early stages, for a major commercial and luxury apartment development that would require rezoning of residential areas, including Oak Ridge Estates. If approved, the land value would increase exponentially. It was a classic land grab, using the HOA as a weapon to force out homeowners who wouldn't sell willingly. Armed with this theory, I reached out to a former acquaintance at the city planning office who confirmed my suspicions off the record. The proposal hasn't been made public yet, but there's a development company called Maxwell Development that's been working closely with Councilwoman Torres to lay the groundwork. They need to own 70% of the properties to force through the dissolution of the HOA and change the zoning restriction. I thanked him and asked for one more favor: a list of properties already sold within Oak Ridge. The results were alarming. Karen and her associates had already acquired nearly 65% of the homes. No wonder they were becoming more aggressive with holdouts like us. The next phase of my investigation led me to James Peterson, a former resident who had moved away 6 months earlier after repeated clashes with the HOA. Frank tracked him down to an apartment 30 miles away. James, a software engineer in his early 40s, was initially reluctant to talk, but when I mentioned Harold Washington's financial discoveries, something changed in his demeanor. "Come inside," he said, checking the hallway before closing his door. "I've been waiting for someone to figure it out." James's apartment was sparse, with moving boxes still unpacked. He led me to a computer setup that seemed excessive for the small space. "Before I left, I installed a back door in the HOA's computer system," he explained, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "They hired me to upgrade their security cameras and network 2 years ago. When I started getting harassed, I suspected something was off, so I left myself a way in, just in case. What James showed me next was the smoking gun I needed. Emails between Karen, Greg, Marcus, and a man named Richard Maxwell, CEO of Maxwell Development. The correspondence detailed their plan to acquire enough properties to force through the rezoning proposal, with projected profits in the hundreds of millions. More disturbing were the explicit discussions about using the security team to encourage reluctant homeowners to sell. One email from Karen specifically mentioned our family, the Sullivans, could be problematic. The father's background in law enforcement means we need to apply pressure carefully. Focus on the son. Teenagers are easier to intimidate. A later email, dated just before Tyler's assault, was chilling in its brevity. Sullivan's situation requires immediate intervention. Reed will handle. I copied everything James showed me, my hands shaking with rage as I prepared to leave. James grabbed my arm. Be careful, these people have a lot to lose. They won't just roll over because you found some emails. His warning proved prophetic. As I drove home that evening, I noticed a black SUV following me. Rather than lead them to my house, I drove to the police station, pulling directly into the visitors' parking lot. The SUV drove past but didn't stop. When I finally reached home 2 hours later, after taking a circuitous route to ensure I wasn't followed, I found signs of a break-in. My home office had been searched, papers scattered across the floor. My computer turned on, though I distinctly remember shutting it down. Thankfully, I had anticipated something like this, and had stored all my evidence on encrypted drives kept in a safe deposit box. Still, the violation of our home, the place where my injured son was recovering, filled me with cold fury. That night I gathered Sarah, Tyler, Michael Chen, and Frank in our kitchen, with Jason joining via secure video call. It's time to go on the coldly at him, actually. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Marcus. Former Officer Reed, dismissed from Riverside PD for excessive force against a 17-year-old suspect. 3 civil suits settled out of court. Hired by Oak Ridge Security despite your record because Karen Whitaker needed someone willing to cross lines. His face pallid as I recited his history. You should ask yourself if Karen and Maxwell will stand by you when this all comes crashing down. In my experience, people like them always need a fall guy. As he stormed off, I knew we had entered the final phase of our battle. The next morning, I received a call from Elaine Washington. Her voice was shaking with excitement and fear. "Robert, I've found something else of Harold's. He kept a safety deposit box I didn't know about. The bank contacted me about renewal fees, and when I went to check it, you need to see this." What Elaine found was explosive, a complete dossier that Harold had compiled on the HOA's financial misdeeds, including bank statements showing funds being siphoned from HOA accounts to Karen's personal accounts and those of her shell companies. There were also recordings. Harold had apparently worn a concealed recording device to several closed HOA meetings where Perrin and Greg openly discussed using security to pressure residents. In one particularly damning recording from just 2 weeks before his death, Karen could be heard saying, "If Washington doesn't back down about the financial review, have Reed pay him a visit. These old people need to understand that heart conditions can be aggravated by stress." Harold had been compiling evidence for a major fraud case, planning to take it to the FBI when he suffered his fatal heart attack. An attack that now seems suspiciously convenient. With this new evidence in hand, I contacted Agent Christine Lewis at the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, another former colleague. After reviewing what we had, she agreed the case warranted federal investigation. This crosses multiple jurisdictions: fraud, racketeering, possible civil rights violations, and if what happened to your son and potentially Mr. Washington can be proven, we could be looking at charges for assault, battery, and even manslaughter, she explained. But I need 24 hours to get the proper warrants in place. Can you hold off making any moves until then? I agreed, though every fiber of my being wanted immediate action. That evening, Samantha Peterson's first article was published online. Neighborhood Nightmare, HOA Security Accused of Brutal Assault on Teenager. The piece detailed Tyler's injuries and included statements from Dr. Martinez about the nature of the assault. It also raised questions about the qualifications of the security personnel and hinted at financial irregularities within the HOA. Within hours, the article had gone viral, with national news outlets picking up the story. Karen's response was swift, a press release denouncing the defamatory and false allegations and announcing an emergency HOA meeting the following evening to address community concerns. I knew this meeting would be their attempt to control the narrative and possibly accelerate their plans before we could stop them. Frank managed to place a trusted associate as catering staff for the meeting, equipped with recording devices. What we captured exceeded our worst expectations. Karen, visibly agitated, revealed the full scope of their plan to the HOA board members who weren't already part of the conspiracy. The deal with Maxwell Development is almost complete. Once we reach the 70% threshold, which we're only a few properties away, we can force the dissolution of the HOA and approve the rezoning. Each of you who has supported us will receive a 5% premium on your property value, plus options for discounted units in the new development. But this Sullivan situation threatens everything. Maxwell is getting nervous. Richard Maxwell himself then addressed the group. I've spoken with Judge Harmon and Councilwoman Torres. They're still with us, but this negative publicity is problematic. We need to accelerate our timeline. Any holdouts need to be dealt with immediately, whatever it takes. Armed with this recording and all our previous evidence, I met with Agent Lewis the next morning. By afternoon, the FBI had secured warrants for Karen Whitaker, Greg Thompson, Marcus Reed, Richard Maxwell, Councilwoman Torres, and Judge Harmon. The arrests were coordinated to happen simultaneously to prevent any warnings or evidence destruction. I insisted on being present when they took Reed into custody. I wanted him to see my face. The FBI tactical team breached the security office at 6 a.m. Reed was already there, shredding documents when agents burst in. The look of shock on his face when he saw me standing beside Agent Lewis was something I'll never forget. Marcus Reed, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, and violation of civil rights under color of authority, Lewis recited, as Reed was handcuffed. As I led him past me, I spoke just loudly enough for him to hear. 28 broken bones, Marcus. That's what you did to my 17-year-old son. In my experience, prisoners have a special place in their hierarchy for people who hurt kids. The dismantling of the corruption ring made national headlines. Karen and her co-conspirators were charged with dozens of felonies, from racketeering and fraud to conspiracy and assault. The FBI investigation revealed that their scheme extended beyond. Sparked a nationwide conversation about HOA reform. Several state legislatures introduced bills to increase oversight of homeowners associations and limit their powers. Media outlets ran investigative series on similar abuses across the country, and a grassroots movement for homeowner rights gained momentum. The public response to our story was overwhelming. We received thousands of letters and emails from people sharing their own HOA horror stories, many of whom found the courage to challenge corrupt practices in their own communities after learning about our fight. The aftermath wasn't easy for our family. Tyler's physical recovery was grueling for months. He endured surgeries, physical therapy sessions that left him in tears, and the psychological trauma of flashbacks whenever he saw someone in a uniform that resembled Reed's. Sarah took a semester leave from teaching to help with his care, and there were nights when I would find her silently crying in our bathroom, trying to hide her pain from Tyler and me. Our savings were depleted by medical bills and security expenses, despite the eventual settlement we received in our civil suit against the HOA's insurance. But we also found unexpected strength in the community that formed around us. Neighbors we barely knew before the incident became like family. The Chens brought dinner every Wednesday for months. Elaine Washington, despite her own grief, sat with Tyler for hours, teaching him to knit as a form of therapy for his damaged hands. The Jenkins family, who had moved back after learning of the arrests, organized a fundraiser that helped cover Tyler's first year of college expenses. These acts of kindness restored our faith in humanity during the darkest moments. As for the conspirators, their stories took different turns in prison. Karen Whitaker maintained her innocence throughout her trial and continues to do so, though her appeals have been repeatedly denied. Greg Thompson turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence, revealing additional corruption that extended to other county officials not initially implicated. Richard Maxwell suffered a stroke 6 months into his sentence and now requires constant medical care. And Marcus Reed, the man who brutalized my son, was stabbed in a prison altercation his first year but survived. I take no joy in that violence, as it only perpetuates the cycle that men like him create. The most surprising development came from Councilwoman Torres. After serving 2 years of her sentence, she was granted limited immunity for testimony in a wider corruption investigation involving several major developers in the state. The information she provided led to indictments against 3 state senators and a federal housing official. Her sentence was reduced, and upon release, she has become an advocate for government transparency, speaking at colleges about the slippery slope that led to her crimes. I remain skeptical of her redemption narrative, but Tyler, in his remarkable capacity for growth, agreed to speak alongside her at an ethics symposium last spring. Judge Harmon, stripped of his position and disbarred, has maintained a defiant silence. His wife divorced him shortly after his conviction, and former colleagues report that he spends his days in prison writing what he claims will be an exposé of judicial corruption, though many suspect it's merely an attempt to deflect from his own misdeeds. The judicial review prompted by his case revealed questionable rulings in dozens of his previous cases, particularly those involving property developers. Several convictions were overturned, and numerous civil judgments are being re-examined. A reminder that corruption in positions of power can leave wounds that take years to heal. One of the most meaningful outcomes emerged when several law schools began using our case as a teaching tool for ethics and property law courses. Last year, I was invited to speak at Michael's University, standing before a lecture hall of bright young law students eager to learn how to use their future profession to protect rather than persecute. Tyler sat in the front row taking notes, even though he'd heard the story countless times. Watching him there, I felt an overwhelming pride. The path that led him to law school was paved with pain, but he's transformed that experience into purpose. The trauma we experienced has left its marks on all of us. I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, replaying the moment I received that hospital call. Sarah has become hyper-vigilant about security, installing additional cameras around our home, even though the threat has passed. And Tyler, my brave, resilient son, still cannot stand with his back to an open door, a defensive habit formed in the aftermath of his assault. These are the invisible scars we carry, alongside his physical ones. But we've also grown in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Our family bond, already strong, has become unbreakable. We speak more openly about our fears and hopes, no longer taking for granted the time we have together. Sarah has channeled her experience into creating a support group for families dealing with trauma, which now meets weekly at the community center.